Right, plenty of other news to get across. Joining me now, Sky News political contributor, Chris Uhlmann. Chris, we've got a lot of politics in Australia I want to get across, but of course we'll have politics very soon now at the Vatican with the sudden news this afternoon that the Pope has died. Pope Francis has died at the age of 88. Of course, he has been unwell for some time. I was there when Pope John Paul II, beg your pardon, died at Easter a couple of years ago. This is the second Pope now to die around the Easter period. It's a Jubilee year for Catholics, of course. Huge crowds will be there at the Vatican. And from this now, we'll see a conclave and an election. Your thoughts on his legacy, because he is the first Jesuit in many years to have such a pivotal role in the church. But of course, he is of the left. He is quite controversial politically for the Catholic Church. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, Peter, well, if you think politics in Australia between the Conservatives and the Labor Party is bad, you should see church politics. And I'm not saying that I'm completely across Vatican politics, but of course Benedict was seen as being from the left, and there is a left and a right in the Catholic Church, and they are very divided. After following on from Benedict, who was seen as being very conservative, so that's 12 years ago. We know the Pope had been sick now for some time. It was probably surprising that he actually got out of hospital. He had double pneumonia and only lasted a few days after getting out of hospital. And of course, those who follow his faith and his convictions will now think that he's going to a better place. But what happens here on earth is what's going to matter next in papal elections. I think there are 136 cardinal electors. I think he has appointed 110 of them. So you know your numbers, Peter. You follow the numbers, and who do you think is going to be elected as the next Pope? It's more likely to be a progressive than a conservative. It'll be interesting to see, though, whether there are any African candidates. The church is very strong there and tends to be a lot more conservative there. So there'll be a lot of interesting comings and goings now in and out of the Vatican as we work our way towards the election of the next Pope. And of course, the Pope matters enormously in terms of the direction of the Catholic Church. So that'll be a fascinating process to watch, and you'd love to be a fly on the wall there. And they have played politics harder than anywhere else on earth in the Vatican now for well over 1,000 years. So, yes, it will be interesting to watch.
Well, I might be Catholic, but given my gender, I think you're more likely to be the fly on the wall in the Sistine Chapel than I'll ever be, but we'll leave that there. Let's go to Labor pre-poll. We obviously know it's opening up tomorrow, but the how to vote cards, these have already been distributed or certainly available on Labor's website. And I went through them in the top of the show. Anthony Albanese, well, he's got his own name there against number one, as you'd expect, but they're preferencing the Greens second in his seat. Likewise in Tony Burke's seat and Jason Clare's seat and a whole lot of others. Even the most senior Jewish MP we've got, the Attorney General Mark Dreyfus, he is preferencing the Greens. Now, this is extraordinary. You look at the Greens, a lot of the Greens are preferencing Labor as well as their second picks. This looks like a deal. I know the PM says he's not going to do a deal with the Greens. Not going to do a deal. I think he's already done a deal.
Oh, look, Peter, are you the least bit surprised? And when we look at the preference flows between the Labor Party and the Greens, many of those MPs would not be elected if it wasn't for Green preferences. Now, those preference flows, in fact, have been growing over the years. I think in 2019, about 80% of Greens preferences went to the Labor Party. And I think at the last election, it was up closer to 85% of Greens preferences went to the Labor Party. So there would be many Labor MPs who would simply not get elected if it wasn't for those Green preferences. And when we look at what happens with the coalition, the preference flows from places like One Nation and what was the UAP at the last election tend not to be anywhere near as strong. They do still tend to favour the coalition, but by nothing like those numbers. I think from One Nation, the preference is around about 60 or 65% compared to the 85% which go from the Greens. So preferences are massively important in the system that we have, and the way that this works is it was always going to be follow the numbers, the same as with the Vatican. How do you think you get elected? You get the numbers behind you, and that's how you get elected.
That makes it look like the PM's just had all this faux posturing against the Greens. It looks like, you know, everything we've heard from him about talking tough is not worth the paper it's printed on.
Well, and when it gets to forming government, of course, the government will do a deal with the Greens if it needs to get into government, if it needs the seats in Parliament. And the only way you can form government in Australia is to have the seats, have the numbers on the floor of the House of Representatives. So you're going to have to do some sort of deal with them. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that they'll have a formal arrangement as they did last time, because that was the death knell of the Gillard government, signing that deal with Bob Brown. But of course there'll have to be an arrangement, and what we'll see is if there is a minority Labor government, that it will be dragged to the left by the Teals and the Greens on the crossbench. But you'd have to say at the moment, Peter, the way that things are tracking is that this could be Labor's 2019, that they could be walking that goat track to victory, that miracle victory that Scott Morrison had. I think Anthony Albanese is quietly confident that he's going to pull that off.
He certainly looks confident today. There was a real pep in his step, and well, we'll see what happens in the next 2 weeks. Let's go to this continuing stoush over the prospect of a Russian airbase in Indonesia. A lot of toing and froing today. The Prime Minister is still making this an issue because it's a discrepancy between what he's saying and what senior ministers are saying. Indeed, Murray Watt yesterday on Andrew Clennell's program. But most of all, I look to the failure of the government to allow the coalition a briefing under the caretaker conventions. Not just the government, I have to say, the public service in Canberra, they are there to administer the caretaker conventions. The government clearly is blocking any such briefing, and the week-old supine public servants are rolling over. I think this is a very, very bad sign, Chris.
Yeah, but again, you know what they say about conventions, it's a convention. There's nothing that's forcing the government to do this. And I think that where there's smoke, there's a little bit of fire here. The initial report came from Jane's Defence Weekly, which is one of the most respected defence publications in the world. So you have to assume the fact that the Russians did ask the question. Now, the Indonesians may have followed that with a very swift no, but it shows an intent from the Russians to get some sort of toehold in our neck of the woods, and not very far from Australia. I do see that the Russian ambassador, I think it was, to Jakarta, saying that Australia has no cards to play. And it's hard to argue with him on that front, because we've just seen recently we don't have the cards to play when it comes with China. When it laps Australia, we can't keep up with our own warships. So we're in a very weak position at the moment in very difficult times. What does it tell us? It tells us that we live in very, very interesting times, and there are lots of countries that have an interest in this part of the world that don't have our best interests at heart. You know, it was unfortunate that Peter Dutton misspoke when he said it was the President's office that had confirmed the fact that there had been a Russian inquiry. There hadn't. It had been a report. So, you know, he's kind of made a bit of a rod for his own back with that one, and you can't blame the Labor Party for bashing him over the head with it.
We've just got some scenes out the front of St Peter's there on the screen for those following the news, of course, that the death of the Pope has just been announced. News poll overnight, no real change in 2PP terms, an uptick for Labor on their primary, coalition unchanged at 35. I mean, 35 is not a win for the coalition. They need something with a 4 in front. Yes, there was some talk about green shoots. You know, the coalition's ahead on the economy. The coalition's ahead on defence. But I mean, please, Chris, if defence is a winner for the coalition, how about you actually get a policy out there on defence and national security? Because, you know, we're opening up for pre-polls tomorrow. We still see nothing yet.
Look, Peter, you've been involved with many campaigns, and I've watched many campaigns, and I don't claim that I'd have a better idea about how they should run their campaign, but I don't think that this has been a particularly good one. It seems to me that there weren't enough policies out early enough for the coalition to make its case to the Australian people. You've got to take into account the fact now that, of course, people are voting early, that's starting tomorrow, and that we did have this election, which was always going to be interrupted by the holiday season, and that's this week as well. Don't forget, we've got Anzac Day on Friday, so this week is a short week. And then we've had all the noise from Donald Trump. So it doesn't look to me at any stage like the coalition has had any rhythm. They have been going backwards in the polls from the beginning of this campaign. They've had to ditch policies, and they've lost at least one politician. So if you're going backwards on all those fronts, it's hard for me to see how you could ever hope to win this election. What they need to do is to get a whole lot closer than where they are now. They have to make this a contest. They have to force the Labor Party into minority government and have enough seats to be a big noise the next time round. But if they allow the Labor Party to win majority government, then I think that the next story is going to be about what goes on in the coalition after the election campaign.
This $600 billion figure, Labor's saying that's the cost of Dutton's nuclear plan in about 30 years' time. Despite being an absolute fanciful time frame, the cost is fanciful. It's a lobby group with charitable status, packed full of Labor staffers, as I've said, and others in it. It's not a credible figure. It's not official government costings or Treasury's numbers worked up. But I've seen a lot of the material that's going into marginal seats, and it's referenced in every one of them to say Dutton needs this much money to pay for the nuclear plan, so cuts are coming your way. This can't stand as any sort of campaign truth. It's a massive scare campaign, but the Prime Minister's repeating it every single day, Chris.
Yeah, and look, even if they were trying to report the Smart Energy Council's own dodgy figures, they would have said that the Smart Energy Council had estimated between $116 billion and up to $600 billion. And of course, all those numbers were bigged up by the Smart Energy Council, which represents wind and solar interests, and of course doesn't want nuclear energy in Australia, even though if you want to get to net zero, you're going to have it. So none of that stuff ever actually adds up to me, except it's pushing the interests of its members, and the interests of its members at the moment is not to have nuclear energy in Australia, because that's not in the interests of making money, which is what its members want to do. So yes, it's a completely bogus figure that's been brought out by the Smart Energy Council, but even if you looked at its own figures, it's somewhere between 116 and 600 billion. And if you looked around the world at the very best nuclear power plants, which are being built in South Korea, the figure's nothing like that. And we've never had a total system cost for Labor's figures. And when we put all that together, that's going to be massively expensive.
We're talking trillions there. Chris Uhlmann, thank you.